Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this special episode of Maisha Kazini. Today we are commemorating the life of David Graeber, who passed away at the beginning of last month. So I am here with Darius Okolla, and together we want to reflect on the ideas of David Graeber and what they mean for us in Kenya today. So welcome, Darius.
Thank you, Antia, for this opportunity to be able to basically speak into a life of somebody whose contribution is yet to even be fully realized. You know, we barely scratched the surface. May his soul rest in peace. But this is a wonderful moment, keeping in mind that this is also being done in many other cities globally. He's being remembered in a lot of other cities of the world. So much appreciated to be here.
Okay, thank you very much. And I apologize to you and everyone else for the hiccups we had with the live recording. We wanted to do this live, but the setup didn't work. So I hope next time we won't have those hitches. So Darius, maybe you can start by, maybe we can talk about how we discovered David Graeber's work. I don't know whether you did before I did. I think I've known him barely a year. I've known his work for barely a year. I don't know about you.
Well, I began, Graeber was one of those public scholars who I would say I got to interact with him amidst many other conversations that were, I was just looking into, having been in the field of economics, which was one of Graeber's central concerns, as a citizen, as a scholar, as a human being. And one of the key moments in my journey, especially in my background in economics, is at one point I get to read a tract. I can't remember the exact book or extract I got it, but it simply talked about the fact that somewhere around the 1970s, especially in the West, there was a confluence of a number of factors that basically magnificently raised the productivity of individuals, the use of technology and a lot of, automation of a lot of the everyday routine tasks that people did. And basically it ensured that companies were making 10, 20, 30 fold of what they used to do before. But then organizations figured out, how do you then explain this leap without having to attribute it to workers? So they created the genius of what you would call the genius of the CEOs. It was suddenly attributed to the fact that, it is, as though these CEOs had suddenly discovered some magic formula of making tons and tons of resources. And by doing so, it came to be a way of, number one, justifying shareholder, increasing shareholders as the central concern rather than the employees and the workers. But also, number two, it justified the huge payouts that they were doing to basically the CEOs. This is the period where the pay of CEOs goes from around 43 times that of the average worker to around 334 times that of the average worker. So you had people like Richard Wolff, you had people, an economist called Thaler, there's, of course, David Graeber, and a host of others who are beginning to say, wait, there's something going on here. There's a lot that is being produced. There's a lot of work that is going on, but it's not being attributed to the people who are actually doing the work. It is being attributed to the CEOs and, some management principles, of course, linked to people like David Drucker, who's regarded as the father of management, the field of management science. And so in many ways, this conversation was about everybody else except the one person it really was supposed to be about, which is the workers, the people who are doing the actual care work, the people who are producing actual things that the society needed, the people who kept the society going, the people who kept the lights on, people who ensured the cars were working, people who ensured the schools were being run and kids were being taught, the people who ensured the people in healthcare facilities were getting taken care of and treated. But because
so when did you
to them,
when did you see this article? Well, how many years back?
I must have been in my second year in campus, and to be really honest, it shifted how I dealt with school in general. This was around the late 2000s, around 2009, 2010. And which is interesting because
you could have told me when I was struggling. I was struggling to work so hard, and I was wondering why it was not working. Oh my. So you always knew about this management racket.
Yeah, so it's interesting because for me, I think it was personal because I'm sitting in these economics classes and I'm listening to all these wonderful things, and you are reading on labor economics and the international markets and all these wonderful things, but something just didn't click,
Yeah.
And so for me, it was being in a class where you're being taught these things, and then because it doesn't add up, you go online and then you realize there's a whole bunch of wonderful people who are challenging some of the, basically what you'd call the economic Bible, the sacred text of economics, which nobody ever questioned. And so that is when I began to see Richard Wolff and Graeber and Thaler and, a whole bunch of people in that space who are already questioning a lot of these things. Yeah.
Yeah, just to remind our viewers that David Graeber is an anthropologist. I don't know whether he did any economics training, but he's, in fact, I just stumbled on him, I think about 2 years ago. I have been researching about performance management, all these neoliberal tactics of extracting as much as you can from workers. So I just stumbled on his work, I think 2 years ago. And the first book I saw was Bullshit Jobs. I don't know where he had been all that time. So I just found Bullshit Jobs. And then I also read an article he had written. It was a short piece where he talked about that the people whose work is the most valuable are paid the least.
Yeah.
And he was talking like cleaners, caregivers, teachers. And then when I read that article, it all came together because I felt, why are we like teachers? That time I was thinking of teachers and medical workers. Why are we so abused by the society? Every time you see people talking in the media, they are talking about how teachers are training useless graduates, medics just want money, and the hospitals are run down. So I was wondering, where is this bile for people coming from? When I discovered Graeber's work, I just said, hallelujah, I have seen the light. And then I think for me, the genius of Graeber was to talk about economics in cultural terms. Like you're saying, economics is brought so scientifically. It's about formulas, money, finance. But, the way we experience it, especially the non-CEOs, it's a cultural phenomenon, and it's a dictatorship, sorry to say, because when you question some of the principles, people look at you like, how dare you question? Is this even questionable? They talk about economics like it's God. And I think for me, the part where I now started saying there's something wrong with this system was when we were doing performance contracts. It just didn't make sense to me. And as I kept on researching and researching and researching, I finally landed on David Graeber after, I think, 4 or 5 years. And then when I read him, I was like, what? Where has he been?
It makes sense now.
Yeah. And for me, this story of the CEOs, it completely clicks. Why are CEOs these stars and they don't do the work? And then I started discovering after that, and I wrote a piece about this, about how managers, these financially trained managers, they don't know the actual work that produces the money that they are counting.
Yeah.
So I didn't understand it until I read him. Yeah.
Yeah. Getting the managers were actually a second or third level on that matrix, because the moment finance capital kicks in full swing around the 70s, mostly in the West, but also increasingly across the globe, what happens is these CEOs are making these huge, getting these huge stock options and huge bonuses, but then it doesn't stop with them. Once this begins to happen and it's attributed to the geniuses of the CEOs, or the sudden geniuses of the CEOs, the next big people to take over are the shareholders, because now they keep promising these basically these CEOs, the more you can deliver a year-on-year profit, the higher your stock options, the higher your bonuses, the higher your salaries. You basically end up with, you start at the age of the celebrity CEOs. You no longer have architects who build institutions. You have now celebrity CEOs who get to be the poster boys of finance capital, just floating from one organization to another and raking and making all kinds of recommendations that are not connected to the people who do the actual work. You get me with my understanding of finance capital into a hospital environment. I don't know the first thing about that, but I know we have a bottom line here to push, and everything from there goes south. So they pushed from the CEOs to the shareholders, but you couldn't hold that for long, because one of the other things that was happening is, once the CEO stockouts go up and the workers start getting abused, the other thing that happens is that wages stagnate. They stopped giving people any salary raises or reviewing people's remunerations. And because that is happening, you have to create a buffer between the CEO, the shareholders, and the people on the ground and the workers. So what do? You create a managerial class. This becomes your buffer between the employees on the ground and the CEOs and the shareholders at the top. So this managerial class ensures, it's basically an administrative bureaucracy that ensures nothing really gets to the CEO. He's up there, untouchable, away from, the masses of workers. Life. Yeah.
And
so
then
that's how the managerial class becomes a thing. They're basically a buffer in this very horrible setup that came out of that the evolution of finance capital.
And then for me, what was interesting, of course, because I'm a culture person, an academic of culture, what is interesting is this what do you call it, infrastructure that makes that narrative believable. So I don't know, maybe we can talk about that. Why is it so easy? What are the pillars that make that kind of narrative, when it comes, so easy for people to absorb? And maybe we can give plus Kenyan examples, because there's a certain CEO who hopped, I wrote about him, who hopped from at least at the time he had hopped from 3 different industries, completely different, and yet he was a star in the media. So what is it that, especially, let's talk about Kenya, but we can talk about the world. What are the underlying beliefs that make such a narrative so believable?
One of them is the media. The media plays a very big role in terms of sanitizing these people. Let's tell you a rags to riches story. Let's tell you, your superhuman CEO story, your ability to, the turnaround CEO kind of a thing. And it started globally. I mean, the David Welch at General Electric, Ali Akoka, what is the name of the embattled Nissan CEO who fled to the French Lebanese, Carlos Ghosn. You have all these mega stars who basically, it's, Wall
even
Street
the tech ones.
Yeah, it's Wall Street meets Hollywood, basically. And so you have all these titans up there, given these huge, larger than life figures. They're given public relations people to handle their media spaces, and they're saying all these meaningless one-liners, on their social media. And nobody ever sits back and says, okay, what is social mobility and what does it look like? What is the political and moral aspect of business, What is, because I mean, the economic question is simply the resource question, how society creates its resources, who creates it, who gets it, how people get to negotiate for it, what are the, the modalities and the infrastructure of how these resources are distributed or consolidated. So the economic question is basically a resource question, and resource question goes beyond economics. You know, there's the cultural side of it. You know, how do these resources come into being? What do we say of those who don't have these resources? Do we go into gaslighting them, or do we acknowledge that maybe the infrastructure that we built around our resource question as a community favors certain kinds of behaviors, or favors certain kinds of people, or favors certain kinds of networks, which not everyone has access to? So it's from that space where you begin to see you've moved this, when you keep it at that media level where these people are able to, basically you sanitize it and you make it look like everybody can do this, you know, and if you're not doing it, you're lazy, or you know, you're not motivated enough, or you're not working 17 hours and sleeping for 2 hours for 6 days a week, you know. So basically, the media does a good job with that. The other one is academia, of course. I think I mentioned something recently, and somebody was surprised because we were taught a particular theory in class. Then I went online. This is the point where I began to question a lot of things. Then I see the same theory had been debunked in 1978. I'm being taught this theory in 2009 in third year, first semester, you know, and nobody even says, I mean, to be fair, okay, teach me the theory, but then tell me the counter theories to this, you know. And where's the space for that? You know, when you portray the free market as a god, when in academia we are teaching these business students that, number one, they can basically run any industry, from mining to healthcare to education to airlines to everything. All they need is a few management principles.
A business degree.
Everything can be boiled down to a business degree and some business principles. And we forget the technicalities and the uniqueness of the respective industries. So you're sending there somebody with a business degree who has no clue what happens in the airline industry, but, you know, I'll go in there and you make all these decisions, you make a mess of things, and of course the system will reward you because you're a poster boy of that space. So the academia does a terrible job of, you know, basically teaching counterpoints to a lot of these things. You can't teach the free market as a god. You can't teach, you know, the whole neoliberalism model as if it's an unquestionable, you know, just it's supposed to just to be ubiquitous. You know, it's one of those things that you want to build more of. Let's question this thing. Let's question this, you know, the theories that we are teaching out here. So academia, the media,
the church.
You know, also.
What about the church?
The bigger challenge with the church is that the church got co-opted into, you know, I mean, it's part of the colonial modernity package. So, of course, it came with a lot of that baggage. You know, they're basically trying to create an alternative government system, which, I mean, to be fair, the private sector has a 70-year head start in Kenya. And given that the private sector, its initial investment was, you know, the colonial schooling system, the hospital system, you know, the basic infrastructure that are supposed to be provided by the government. So when you have a country that is 130 years old, give or take, and the first 70 years of it was run as a private system where, you know, the colonial enterprise, the colonial empire provided the public social services that are supposed to be provided by the government. By the time the government, or, you know, the independence is declared, so to speak, in 1963, you basically have had an alternative government running for over 60, 70 years, you know, and a lot of these don't want to let go.
But also the missionaries actually came before the private sector, and the missionaries, their job was to convert people for private capital. So for them, the evidence of conversion to Christianity was that now you're having a job and you're earning money from a settler. So for them, that was the epitome of being a Christian. So actually the church prepared people for capital. So when now you have this celeb CEO turn from the 90s, then you also have pastors modeling the CEOs actually. So even in their clothes, they are talking. In fact, sometimes you can't even tell the difference between a pastor and a motivational speaker, you know, because they're basically, they have the same profile, the same aura, the same clothes, the same talk, And in fact, they even started having conferences together, right?
There are two forces that feed into that. There's what happens with the emerging church movement in the 70s that basically begin to talk exactly like Peter Drucker, start saying, everything has to be measurable, including in church. I don't know how you're going to measure people's souls, but yeah, somehow they assume they could. And there are books around it, actually, and some of them are actually touted even here in Kenya. Basically, books that are built around telling people, church has to be run as something almost just close to a business. Everything has to be measurable and everything has to fit, within that model. They didn't realize that was a model even people within the business world were questioning. Now, how worse does it get when religion adopts that? So there's the colonial missionary setup, and then there's the colonial enterprise and the colonial state 130 years ago. The private sector, the colonial private sector basically, and then the colonial missionary setting with the church. And of course, that's pretty much tentacles of the same bigger colonial global infrastructure. But then what we begin to see, especially in the last 30, 40 years, is basically the effect of what finance capital was doing with those CEOs and their big payout in the 70s and going into the 80s and going into the 90s, is the church adopted a more or less similar approach also of saying everything has to be measurable. Remember, that is actually a phrase from Peter Drucker, what cannot be measured cannot be something,
Cannot, so, what cannot be counted does not count.
Yeah, so it becomes their thing in there. So it's the moment that gets into the church, of course, the church and business are not far off. And remember, there's already a pre-existing relationship between colonial missionary and colonial private enterprise.
Capital,
so it was it was a modernization of that relationship. So you can take what say CMS and the colonial governor were doing in 1940, and you can draw parallels between what the church is doing in the 80s and the 90s with the private sector. It was basically a modernization of a very old relationship in a sort of a recalibration of that relationship into a more modern or modernized context. And so that is where the church becomes part of this thing. Basically, the church starts to being co-opted, first of all, with the state, of course, but also mostly with the business side of things. And in many ways, the church comes out more corrupted than even the business sector. Because the business sector, they're already questioning it. There are people who are questioning this. And of course, even on the church side, there are people who are saying, no, this is not how to go about doing, work. This is not how to look at work. This is not how to talk about remuneration. This is not how to approach the question of even the theology of work, work as God's gift to us, work as something that is meaningful beyond,
beyond the money that it makes.
Yeah, and the shareholding, the purely
monetary
end of things. Yeah. So
in fact,
what work means for our souls. Yeah.
Yeah. And for the sake of those who are watching, just to clarify, just to remind us that prosperity gospel is basically that language, the language of things are measured by value. So even prosperity gospel says that your faith is evident in the money that you make. And if you're not making money, it means that you don't have faith. Yeah, so that's where the prosperity gospel comes. I just wanted to go something you mentioned about public relations, and I wanted to hear what you think or your views on the spin-off industries that have come from this CEO whatever. And I don't know, and which for me, even when I think of David Graeber's work, I started to see that now you have a whole spin-off industry that is supposed to support this monster of financial capital. So I don't know, maybe you can talk about public relations and any other industry that is part of this whole story.
It's industries that build upon other industries that build upon other industries. Once once it becomes this neoliberal marketize everything needs to have a price, everything needs to be measurable, becomes this absolute philosophy that nobody questions. Then along the way, one of the things that happens is, of course, you need to find a way to spin these. Who do you use? You go to Madison Avenue and basically tell them, okay, how do we get me somebody who can clean this up after us, then it becomes also a violence in language, you're being told you're not working hard enough, you're not, if you only did A, B, C, D, there are just 3 steps here you need, and there are just 4 keys here you need. And funny enough, part of that also came from church. I mean, there's an American Reverend Norman Vincent Peale from back in the day. He had started on this positive thinking movement.
Yeah.
Then of course he comes along, and so the language evolves over time to also take over both the church side of things, but also this other side where you're being told what you're seeing. You're being told your reality is not true, because workers can see, I'm working harder than I used to do before. I'm way more productive now because I have more tools in my hands and more skills in my hand, and I have a better collaboration with the people around me who we work on together to get this stuff done. But I'm looking at my wages, they're not, growing commensurate with not only my effort, but also the economy that I'm living in. But then one of the things that happened, and I think Richard Wolff talks about it, especially in the West, is people began to take on debt to cover up for this deficit. Nobody was, because you're being told, you're being gaslight, you're being told it's you who's not working hard enough, it's you who's not doing these 4 keys and those 4 principles of this or that. So people begin to believe maybe something wrong with me, but because they can't account for it, then they go into debt as a thing, which actually Graeber talks about, it's one of his first books.
Debt, the first 5,000 years.
Yeah, so he goes into that, and it's becomes one of the bigger element of how the system works. So now let's provide a whole credit market to be able to run this pretty much capital, because we are taking more from these people, we are giving them less and less because we can get away with it. We've gotten our people to spin it such that they can say, we've suddenly become geniuses, people should move to gig economy, and a whole other troubling thing. So people take on debt until it gets to a place where they're so overwhelmed by debt, student debt, your own personal loans, you have to deal with business loans here and there. Basically, you end up building an enterprise where people are not able to do anything meaningful unless they take on a certain level of, debt. But again, as the old rule goes with all debt, there comes to the date where it has to be paid, and a lot of people couldn't. And that is where you have the 2007 crash, which was basically everybody was just in this game, and the whole principle was just make sure you cash in before, don't be the last person to cash in, because it's going to go down with you. And it went down with a lot of people. I mean, in 2007, 2008, and of course, there's the global contagion from that. But that was essentially how this thing works. So you get these certain publicists and people surrounding these basically these CEOs and the shareholders, people whose job basically is to ensure that people talk about anything except what they're really seeing, which is I'm being more productive and I'm being paid less. So tell them about entrepreneurship, tell them about the gig economy, tell them they're not working hard enough, tell them if they don't have enough money, they can access cheap loans here to try and keep their standards of living as they are before, because their wages adjusted for inflation are not increasing. So you build this very elaborate web of narratives that talk about everything except the fact that these workers are doing more and getting less for it. And less not just monetarily, also including their capacity to, the level of power they have over what they are producing.
And so basically, and this was one of the things I found so fascinating with David Graeber. He talked, you've mentioned the public relations as one of those industries, and then there's credit and finance, which are these spin-off industries whose sole job is just to keep this crazy system going. And then, of course, we've mentioned the church, and then maybe we'll talk about education later. I think for me, one of the most surprising things for me has been that there's all this work out there questioning neoliberalism, performance management, all these, all these things that people do. And yet in the academy, you never hear that conversation. And when you try to bring it up, people look at you like, are you crazy? Where does this even come from? And yet the next minute you'll be told, you people are not doing research. But I've done the research and I'm telling you what's happening and you're not. Anyway, I never understood that one. So there are those spin-offs, these industries which are there to just keep the system going. So the next phase of our discussion, I want to go to, you've already mentioned violence, the violence of language, but I also wanted to hear about the violence of the workplace, because one of the things David Graeber brought out for me in Bullshit Jobs, in fact, for me, reading that book saved my soul. It did, because the workplace has become, especially the bureaucratic workplace, has become cruel. It is cruel. In fact, the word Graeber uses is sadistic. It's like there's a joy or fulfillment the workplace gets from making people more and more miserable. So I'd like to hear you talk about the violence, and this is of course not violence with pangas and guns. It's the violence of bureaucracy and the fact that it has become so sadistic now that it's as if there's no work if people are not suffering. And in fact, actually, in that book, I think he does a whole chapter on that idea that you are not working unless you're suffering. So if you're doing work that brings you fulfillment, there's a way in which people say, then there's something wrong then you're not working, or there's something wrong with the work. So violence of language and the workplace.
It's an interesting one. I mean, because the ultimate violence actually starts with the finance capital itself, and you see, I mean, we say these things, but we never really think about it. The nice girls never get the corner office, all the bastards get ahead, there's no such thing as a corporate ladder. It's just people stepping on each other all the way to the top. Like we kind of say these things as if it's like a fetishization of sadism, like you can't be human and get ahead, nice guys finish last, we put all these statements out there, and mostly in relation to, our modern work and workplace, not just offices, but every other space where conversation about production, whether it's services or actual goods and goods that produce, or products, or even advice or care work, these things float around, but we never really look into how did we get here. First of all, you look at the world of finance capital as it was established back in the 70s, and especially when it gets blended with tech. What happens is, in those industries, those are places you find people do 100-hour work week, 14 hours a day kind of jobs. And they don't just do it. They consider that a mark of honor, to be able to do 14 hours in those spaces. And so they figured, I'm here seated somewhere in Wall Street, doing 14 hours, which is 96 hours a week. Then I get to walk away with $100,000, and above, plus huge stock bonuses. Everybody else should be like me, because I mean, look, I'm bastardizing myself. I'm messing myself up. I'm also messing you up, because now I'm ensuring that everything has to go through some sort of a capital metric, including your work as teachers and doctors and caregivers, which can't fit that model, but somehow will squeeze something and create some sort of bottom line out of it. So this violence is enjoyed at a certain level, in that financial capital framework here. And because
have you watched The Wolf of Wall Street? I haven't had the guts yet.
Me too. I saw snippets then. I skip it every time I'm on Netflix.
Hollywood movies on work, I avoid them because they glorify torture.
That kind of madness. Because
The Devil Wears Prada.
Yeah, that torture pays for them because at least monetarily, and for most of them, they have either the proclivity or the disposition to do that 96-hour work week with zero social life without showing up for family and other people, and it pays them, and they're fine with it. I remember Chicago School of Business. One of the ladies CEOs, what was her name? Sally somebody. It was a few years back, and she was saying how there was a disparity in terms of the gender dynamics in the school, where there are more, of course, ladies than the gents in there. But she used to say, every time people graduate, 90% of the men, interestingly, would head for Wall Street to do those 100-hour work week, and the ladies would prefer to go into what Americans call the main street, where actual work takes place. And she'd ask, why would you do that? And a lot of them are saying, I want my life to have a bit more than just doing 96-hour work week. These men didn't mind because, I mean, the entire framework is you have to do that work that gives you $100,000. So,
and can you talk about that, the gender dynamics? Because, for example, there's this scene in Michael Moore's movie, Where to Invade Next, where he goes to Iceland. And he says that all the banks that collapsed were the banks which were led by men, because the men were taking more risks, and the women were not as risky. In fact, the principle they had was, if I don't understand a financial product, I'm not implementing it. But the men were willing to do that, and of course there was more collapse on that end. So maybe you could tie those gender dynamics into the model of finance.
Yeah, I mean, and that's usually the best case for having a wider pool of people consult, both in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of who produces and who is in leadership. When I mean, generally men would take those kinds of risks. There's a whole other dynamics in terms of the gender and the socialization in there. But then when you have more men going into this thing, and not just all men, but a particular type of man, who can willingly, do this self-immolation for, a few more $100,000, and they don't mind it, the disfigurement that it does to them, or maybe they can cope with it. I don't think even as a man I have the proclivity, that kind of a proclivity, but yeah, people took it up, and that changes a lot, because when they think, well, I can do it here, why don't teachers also do 96-hour work week? Why don't doctors do it? Why don't, because again, and why don't even fellow men do it? Because as I said, it's not all men who'd go for that kind of that kind of self-flagellation for an extra buck. But then it becomes then the norm in that space. But you see, again, it goes back to the fact that people do different kinds of different kinds of work. You can't take somebody who's doing 96 hours in Wall Street flipping digits on a screen board and tell a doctor to do the same. Yeah, I mean, they're going to start making mistakes. You don't push that on teachers. You don't push that. People who do actual work need way more balance, way more diversity in terms of their life experiences, their relationships, and everything else. And even their approach to work and how they view their work and the kind of feedback loop they have, self-feedback loop they have with their work is different from somebody who's caught up at the heart of that, Wall Street kind of, money dynamic. So the moment they started pushing it on everyone else, it became complete violence, because not many people can sustain that. It's not even advisable for majority of the population. Maybe there are people who can, but it's not everyone's thing. So
and like
that was one of the big violences.
And then like teachers, now we started being told to measure our performance by numbers. Can you imagine? You have students in a class, you're mentoring them, you're interacting with them, and you're forced to reduce that interaction to a number. It was just violent. And then I read, there was a story told by Kathy O'Neill, and I'll share it with those who are watching, where she was saying that the teachers in the United States were also given that kind of performance management. And the formula for ranking a good teacher and a not good teacher was never disclosed. They had this algorithm that would play games. So one year a teacher is the best teacher, another year that same teacher is the worst, is ranked as one of the worst teachers. And it's the same mathematics that is being used to calculate. But of course, she's not in the, I mean, those people who are coming up with these management tools are not in the classrooms. They're not in the wards. They're not in the theaters. They're not in the chambers. They don't know what that kind of work, how that kind of work is done. And maybe one of the industries we should also have mentioned was the consultants. These management consultants who come and they harvest ideas from the company employees themselves, and then they get paid for putting it in a packet with glossy pictures and all that. But let's go to language, because you were the first person I heard talking about the violence that is meted. I don't know whether it's through language or, and in fact, actually, I'm trying to teach a course on that this semester. It's difficult, but let's talk more about that, language.
Basically, when I think I picked that idea from, it's a Brazilian sociologist, and he was talking about how the epistemic violence unleashed on the favelas as part of the ways of justifying what both the state but also the criminal gangs were doing to the society. You know, basically it's somebody taking your reality and saying something that contradicts your reality, but in ways that it makes the wider society begin to see itself. So basically, it's a what would you call it? It's, you're gaslighting people, but at almost a social level. So it's not an individual coming to you. It's somebody questioning reality and manufacturing certain realities through language that contradict how you view yourself. As you know, I remember I talked about it before, where they're telling you, you know, maybe you're not just working hard enough, or you know, there's this rags to riches story. So if you're not, you know, doing this, then you probably just has something to do with you. You know, basically you center it at an individual or a community of people, but ensure that nothing is ever said about the structures. Nothing is ever, you never do a structural analysis of the reality these people live in. So center it on the individual. You're not working hard enough. You're not, you're not.
And if you try to say about the society and the structure,
when you start having conversation at that level, first of all, they've created a system where it's always about the individual. You know, exams, which is something you've talked about as hazing. You know, it's the tyranny of the 3%. And the reason you can't talk about the society itself is because the framework that was created around this resource question is a one of assimilation. And I think it's something you've mentioned before, where you don't go to school to get skills or to understand your society or to, you know, to become a good citizen who's able to, you know, understand what's happening around them and make the kind of alternative decisions that would advance the society forward. What you're doing is basically you want to ensure that, you know, basically you're creating the tyranny of the 3% who'll make it to university, who'll, at least by making it to university, are supposed to then be able to take over this leadership. But then even within that framework, the people who made it into that is, of course, the home guards and the, you know, the feudal masters, the black colonialists and the chiefs that we had here. And so because this system is about, you created this tyranny of 3%, you socialize selfishness, you know. It becomes, well, as Darius, I'll perform well here, I'll go to high school, never mind 51% want to join me in high school, you know, which is basically half of my class. Then once it gets to high school, you know, do your 4 years, and then 3% or 4.5% of you will make it to campus. The other 96%, you know, a few will make something out of themselves, and the rest can just fizzle out. So when you create that system, you've legitimized and socialized this. Just take care of yourself. You know, it's a system where you, once you've done that, you ensure that people, nobody ever sits back and says, what happens to the 51% I left in primary school? You know, what happens to the other 90% I left in high school? You know, we finished high school and they weren't able to get into this, to stick to the channel that, we've created as part of this colonial infrastructure. What becomes of their story? It becomes, you get ahead, get up there, maybe you throw crumbs at them along the way, say they were not, smart enough. So it created this funnel that ensures nobody is able to sit back and say, why not improve this system such that you have full transition, or you have as many as possibly can move to the next level. But because it's not a system built to create actual opportunities, because it's a system designed to produce a certain number of people to take over a certain number of opportunities in the system, everybody who falls outside of this system, their fate is not supposed to be a question that comes up, anyway. They're supposed to fade out.
Yeah. They're supposed to be socially insignificant, basically.
Yeah.
And that explains why Kenyans resent talking about social issues. They keep saying, like, you're told, why are you saying we, say I? You're told, why are you excusing failure? I remember, like, when there were those mass failures in KCS, people were saying, I'm excusing cheating by asking, what about them? Because, in fact, actually what Matiang'i did was to give Kenyans the language to dismiss each other, to call each other cheats if they had not made it in the system, and to refuse any conversation about what happens to them and why should they be treated that way.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah. Because, so maybe we can move to, oh dear, this one bothers me. The younger people, talking of violence of language, the way they are not doing well economically, of course.
Yeah.
Because now this, I don't know. How are we talking about young people and their access to the economy, and also the economy itself in the way it relates to young people? The cheats is one of them, calling them cheats. And maybe of the millennial, that whole discourse, what is it about?
What has happened is that actually by around late 80s, 1980s, what had happened by that point is that the colonial state, which had survived that long, or at least the black colonial plantation economy, basically it had gotten to a point where it had all the people it would need to function within its ranks of administrative bureaucracy. But then people are still giving birth, people still have families out here, their kids are still growing, the population, of course, is growing. So one of the things that happened, especially through the 90s, is the invention of what you'd call, safety valves. Safety valves is basically the fact that in this country, you didn't go to school to get, to go out there and become a citizen who can articulate his reality, the reality of this society, and, get a skill or two that can help you, or a trade that can help you, fend for yourself. So what happens is there's the state, or the plantation economy, which is supposed to be pretty much the only existing economy, in the country, and where everybody who goes to school is, and then everybody else is supposed to fade out. But then what happens when there are so many people who get to the end of this pipeline, articulate enough to begin to understand their reality, but you can't push them out there into social oblivion. So you start creating safety valves. I mean, we had the NGO Act 1990, one of our good safety valves, push a whole bunch of, some of these educated graduates there, multipartyism did a bit on that.
So, sorry, just to go back, what exactly about the NGO Act? Was it encouraging NGOs, or what was that?
And then the NGO Service Act 1990, it's basically you formalize the space, and frame it as part of our social, economic, and political infrastructure, whether through advocacy or, provision of water services, gender empowerment, all these conversations that are had at the NGO aspects, the side of society.
Sorry, let me go, because I've never had that perspective. So let me just dig there. So basically, you're saying they're mainstreaming these conversations, but not in the political sphere where they should be had. So it's basically a spin-off. It's a spin-off.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. What happens is it becomes a safety valve, because you see, you have all these graduates who people are supposed to fed out at the primary school level and high school level, where they're not able to, articulate what's happening. So you push them out, they become socially, they go into social oblivion. But then you have graduates who have, gotten a bit of understanding of how the world works around them. They have these networks of their friends, but then they cannot be absorbed into the political economy. So what do? You send them into this,
NGO.
the NGO side of
and
things, the advocacy side of things.
Yeah. I have to, gosh. And there's something really strange about the NGO space. It gives you the feeling of doing something.
No,
but
definitely.
Really you're not. Because you still don't have the political instruments. So you're told, okay, go do advocacy, go and do the civic education. But really, you don't have power. You still have to wait for the political class to do that.
Yeah, it's an entire administrative bureaucracy by itself. It's what what is it called? The manufactured dissent. You're basically sending these kids out there to ensure that they never ask a political question, because in and of itself, it achieves some things here and there. It gets a few things done, but overall, it is a safety valve. So that was then for the 90s.
Okay.
Then you come under Kibaki. There was an interesting dynamic with Kibaki, which is Kibaki created, Kibaki worsened the problem for the colonial state, because of course, the expansion of university education, which is not something that's supposed to happen, basically 96% of these kids are supposed to fed into social oblivion. So of course there's a lot of its problems, the commercialization, the whole management thing coming in there. But overall, it creates such a huge pool of graduates, such that if you look at the clusters in this country, the 20 to 47, 48-year-olds are the most literate generation in this country. They have the highest number of degrees, which makes sense because when Kibaki comes in 2002, up until the time he's leaving in 2013, that is the cluster that was the university age. So he worsened the problem for the colonial state, such that he pushed all his kids into school. They come out at the other end, they don't have the job. So Moi got at least a bit of a reprieve with the NGO sector as a safety valve. Kibaki really didn't need a safety valve per se, especially generationally speaking, because there are certain things that resources was moving around the banking sector, the telecom sector, the motorbikes. He subsidized the ICT sector, which created quite a number of opportunities, opened up a few things here and there in the economy, and so money moved around quite a bit. So he never needed to create a safety valve, because the kids would have come after him, especially because of what happened in 2007. Were out there busy working on, something else. So you
okay,
come
just
to...
let me pause there. But this is also the time when the Nini CEO, the celeb CEO, was also coming. So even if the money is circulating more, the cultural interpretation of that was still individualist. I don't know, is there a contradiction there?
It's just that there was also, we have had to deal with the tyranny of low expectations again. We'd never gotten to a place where we could begin to question who gets what level of the returns of productivity, So a lot of people are good enough with what they were making, in as much as the CEOs were making 10, 20, 30. Right now it's almost 443 times more, So these things were happening, but overall the things were going up, so
basically,
at least temporarily, yeah.
So basically, people were not questioning it, because even if the proportion had become so wide, at least they were not struggling. So
yeah, they were still getting answers,
there was no
few things here
incentive
and
to
there.
ask.
Mhm.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so this becomes their thing. But then you get to 2013, these two characters come in, and something shifts, over there, because suddenly the two can't figure out, how to move this economy forward. And one of their bigger challenges was the fact that, number one, the center had become too exhausted. And that's, I think, part of the, if I'm not mistaken, part of the recommendations about the 2007 violence and how to move forward.
Okay, explain that the center was exhausted.
Yeah, the center was exhausted, both, in terms of its political economy. There's only so much you can do in this Nairobi, So move everything out of the center, begin to push, both economically, politically, culturally, begin to push the country outwards, But then you have a whole bunch of characters here who's, as one public scholar likes to joke, their worldview ends at Kinungi. They can't imagine of a world that, is not centered around the political economy they inherited from, the colonial characters. So you have
just pause there.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying to push outwards,
mm-hmm.
but Nairobi is now being consolidated. So what do you mean?
Well, it's the pushing outwards was part of it was stuff like LAPSET, because
okay.
The one thing that was happening was you have the former president in power. He's opened up all these educational opportunity, but then because the political economy itself, the conversations you're already having is the challenge with the civil service and the conversation about it being bloated. So the question becomes, where do all these kids you're taking to school go? Which opportunities do you have lined up for them once they're out of here? And Kibaki was able to avoid that question because the economy generally was, it was limping along. It would get a few here and there. Yeah, so people were fine, sort of ish. But then it comes to these two, and one of the ways they would have had to change the country, of course, you were talking about devolution, getting things away from the center to, on the ground. You're talking about, opening up northern Kenya and, developing that side, because there's no other economic blueprint right now in this country that has the capacity to basically rescue an entire generation that they've, pretty much just sent into quite a level of economic hardship, So let's say you open up the north, you have a few million acres up there. People need to build homes there. You build the roads, the schooling systems, the hospitals up there. Basically, by pushing everything outwards, you would have been able to create an almost 100-year space for expansion, because southern Ethiopia is there, Jubaland in Somalia is there, northern Uganda, which is also just close by. On this other end, you have parts of southern Sudan. So that would have been one of the big aspects that they would have gone for. But there's so much, basically an insularity, just a chronic incapacity or inability to understand the society they lived in. So instead of letting this decentralization, whether through devolution, through LAPSET, through, allowing people to pursue economic, social, and cultural opportunities away from the center, what you begin to see, and especially from around 2015, is a reconsolidation of a centralized power. These fights with the governors, a lot of resources, skewed resources being allocated to or around Nairobi as the capital. And so you begin to see this. The other thing is they quickly realize that, uneducated, providing mass education or, basically education to a huge cluster of people is problematic. So what do? They
CBC.
begin that, they throw in CBC, they do this thing where they suppress the marks and call it, what do they say, kids who are cheating before that. All this is part of them trying to correct what they consider a mistake, quote unquote, that Kibaki did, which was to open the economy and ensure that people who are generally supposed to be socially invisible suddenly could no longer be socially invisible. And that's a problem they're not willing to fix.
Okay, so I know,
Yeah.
I'm just curious if you can comment on how that is being expressed culturally, because you've talked about the economics, the fact of reconsolidation of resources in Nairobi and power and, you know, giving governors headaches. But how is that done culturally? Because I feel it. There's something I feel, but I'm still not able to put it in words, that the cultural space has constricted. So I don't know whether you have some tips on what that could be, because I just feel like, okay, I mean, the kind of performance and excitement that we had when Kina Kwani were there, Story Moja Festival, the musics and what,
Jalada,
I don't feel that excitement anymore.
There's, I mean, you know, definitely there's a reason I call these characters the primitive elites. You know, we tend to think of primitivity, or at least in the colonial and racist sense, as people who can't speak, you know, the international languages as they're considered, you know, somebody who doesn't have a certain level of material and economic sophistication. But then there's a certain kind of primitivity in this country that actually, you know, dresses really sharply and is around here with Jessicas. You know, it's just, it's a unique kind of primitivity that is stuck with our elites. And you see, the problem with that kind of, again, because they went through the education system, but as we said before, the education system was not for literacy and, you know, giving kids skills and an opportunity at employment. It was an assimilation model to ensure that once you jump through these hoops, you become part of the 3%, your competence notwithstanding. But then you suddenly, with Kibaki, there's enough resources flowing around to allow for alternative cultural spaces. People begin to have conversations that these elites who went through school but didn't study can't counter. You know, you have Kwani, you know, asking all kinds of questions. You have Story Moja, you have Jalada, you know, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening at Gote, at Creatives Garage, at Power 254, you know, and you have all these hubs, you know, even including Mombasa, a lot of stuff happening in Kilifi, the Zanzibar Book Festival, which had a lot of Kenyans, you know. There's a lot of liaison going on. There's a lot of cultural production going on. There's a lot of, you know, invention of new language, but also giving language to new realities, you know, and something that this elite did not, or even still up to now, do not have the language to counter that. And so what does it do? It creates a paranoia. So you have to, you know, the number of things that happen. First of all, you have these outright, you know, take down on some of these institutions, which, I mean, we've seen some of these conversations online, what happened to some of these cultural spaces. But then you also have the economic question, which is basically because the resources we began to lose the resources. So for example, you look at the year 2015, about 2.2 million SMEs shut down, you know, which is like one of the highest rate of loss of businesses, you know, owned by individuals in the country. Of course, once the resources begin to you know, to lose out, then the grip of the state on a lot of these cultural spaces becomes too much. So a lot of them shut down. Of course, some of them had their own internal bureaucratic problems and, you know, fallouts and a whole bunch of challenges. But then there's these outside forces where this becomes one of those spaces that the system doesn't have a control over. They have a control over university, you know, through, you know, the institutions and agencies. But how do you begin to have a hand on some of these cultural spaces? And some of them, it was pure infiltration, which are some of these conversations that have been out here in the public. So that begins to sort of lose out. But then a lot of these people are still out here. But then how are they handled? One of the ways they're handled is, you know, we begin to be called names. You know, we use the name activist as sort of a pejorative. You know, we say rabble rousers. You know, use language. What is your solution? You're always criticizing. You know,
Do you see anything positive?
Do you ever see anything positive? So it becomes anybody who is not falling for the straight and narrow narrative that has been sold, you know, for decades. You begin to be ostracized. Is this, you know, basically being pushed out into the margins, and you become sort of a hot, these are loose cannonball. We can't deal with that one, and so that of course comes with a certain level of social and economic sabotage, and eventually you get to pretty much reconsolidate this space. So a lot of the death of these cultural spaces, there's economic questions, there's the fact that these primitive elites couldn't counter a lot of what was being said there, and with the one thing about primitive elitism is its first of all, it's chronic incapacity to develop anything, but also paranoia and you can almost say an entire class-wide insecurity. You simply have this whole cluster of characters who cannot live or cannot coexist with something that they can't appropriate, they can't own it, or they can't pretty much have their hand on it, or control over it. And the cultural spaces were one of those. I mean, what Binya used to say, what Richard Oduku, they used to do, the Magungas out there, our musicians out here, So these three major factors: the economic questions and the loss of resources that could have helped there, the state, and basically the primitive elites pushing back, because this is one thing that was making them very paranoid, because they couldn't counter, or they couldn't answer it, or they couldn't control it. It's just that the beauty of it is that, so for example, when we did the millennial edition, that was 2 years ago, May of 2018, I mean, social media ensures that there's only so much they can do. There's only so much. Social media and just generally social spaces have allowed for certain, you can say, generational and class solidarity among the millennials, that no matter how much repression goes on in the cultural spaces, the conversation will always be somewhere out there in a blog, somewhere in a podcast, somewhere in a YouTube conversation, somewhere, a lot of these millennials have been able to curate certain spaces online that don't, in many ways, beyond the reach of the state, the reach of the primitive elite. So it's shrinking, but there are newer ways also of going around that kind of repression and bureaucracy that I don't think they can entirely extinguish it. So yeah, I think it's looking up in many ways.
Oh gosh, that's good to hear, because I was beginning to feel, especially when we are attacked and told what's your solution and all those other bad things people say, I started to wonder, is it because we have no impact? But actually we do.
We have. I mean, it's to be fair, Wandia, I mean, you've done a good job in that space. I mean, some of these questions, there are a lot of these questions that would have been asked 3 years ago that people no longer ask. What was your solutions? People, you never see anything positive. And the incompetence of these characters has done part of that job for us. Like, even people who might have been initially fooled are beginning to realize, oh, these ones, these are not the kind of characters you can defend. So there's a lot of work we've been able to do in the public space, and introduction of new phrases. In fact, should I even say that part of this conversation going on politically in terms of the aristocrats and everybody else, and that has been hijacked by a certain bunch of characters. The truth of the matter is, these conversations, they didn't start them. The class conversation is something we've had in different spaces, just that now they seem to have hijacked it for political ends,
and isn't that amazing? I never imagined, even with all the problems that story has, I never imagined that class would be mainstreamed in Kenyan politics. That that we would now be talking about that they're actually rich and poor, and we need to have a conversation about that. Never mind how it is done, but at least it has the foot is in the door.
Yeah, we've come a long way. I mean, aristocrats, the feudal aristocrats. We talk about this as a plantation economy. So we've done the social side of this work. We've done the intellectual side of this work. It's only now that the political, and given how charged our politics can be, it's now that it's simply getting political legs. But we've simply done every other work on the class conversation. And that is why I mean, despite a little bit of exasperation, I should say that this conversation will outlive the political hijackers, you know, because it had a life before they took over. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So it will outlive them, definitely. It's going to grow beyond. I mean, they might use it for political expediency for a year or two, but this is something, the class conversation is going to be around for at least 10 years, if not more. So we are on a good path, you know, limping or not, we've moved, we made some distance, we've covered some ground. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe, you know, it's one thing to dislodge some of these factors, but it's also another thing to name where we are going. And then maybe using the ideas of David Graeber, you know, should we be thinking about? Before you go, I'll just say that one of the things he talks about, which is a very radical idea, but not so radical, is just letting people do what they do. And he has a very strong faith in human beings. And he says that most human beings just want to have a decent life and be creative, and that's it. And for him, that would imply, you know, for example, lessening the number of work hours so that people can go home and be creative. And I don't know whether this is linked to him, but some people have been talking about a universal basic income. But basically, there's this idea that most human beings just want to live a decent life, and they should be given the opportunity to, which they don't have, which is, those are some of the ideas. But just going forward, what are the basic directions that we should be thinking about?
There are quite a number. Yeah, there are quite a number. One of them is the fact that we need to begin moving, you know, keep at this conversation about decentralizing this society. Where we are, the political economy, what we would call the plantation economy, is exhausted. It can it no longer has the capacity to absorb even the children of those home guards, you know.
And that's why they have like 100.
Yeah, the state has gone broke because now, you know, they're going through the same kind of problem Saudi Arabia went through. You know, they put all these kids of the Saud family under, you know, some sort of an income, and then 4 generations later and 5 wives each, you know, you basically have 100,000. Now you can't keep giving everybody $19,000 a year, you know, so it becomes a problem.
Oh, good.
So, yeah, that's where these characters are, because if you started with your 34 chiefs, and then, you
each
know,
with 4 wives, some with even 40.
Yeah, some with 40 wives, and then each of their kids have 2, 3 wives, and 11 children, 13 children, and then now you're on the 4th, 5th generation. The political economy can no longer sustain that kind of a number, even if it was just to work for them alone. So it's not just not working
and
for
they
everybody
are not
else. It's not even working for these home guards. Yeah, I mean, they're simply stuck in the administrative bureaucracy and, you know, getting to live off state legacies.
Let me just jump in there, because you've mentioned administrative bureaucracy. How do we get rid of that monster? And what is it? I don't understand it. It just keeps cropping up, and people feeling that you need to have 5, 10 people to order around. You need a PA, and you know, how do we get rid of that?
They're heading to a place where a lot more is demanded of the state, and because number one, the resource question which they can't fix, because at this point where they are, without that kind of resources, I see they've already frozen employment for 3 years. I'm just hoping that the casualties, one day the people Graeber talks about who do the actual work. But then the resource question will force them to address that. The convenience of technology will force them to deal with that question. The fact that people are questioning this narrative of celebrity CEOs and, you know, turnaround gurus, both in the government, in church, in all these other societal structures, means you can no longer justify having those kinds of, you know, characters basically kept in the system. So everything else is working against the possibility of sustaining that kind of administrative bureaucracy for long. Even if it hangs around, it's pretty much on its way fading out at this point. And the greater sense of accountability demanded of the state, the greater scrutiny that the state gets, and just the wider society gives to respective institutions, both state, private sector, the church, the social aspects of institutions that we have in the country. So that one is pretty much on its way out.
But isn't it the demand for accountability that is increasing the bureaucracy? Because what happens is when somebody is asked questions and they can't answer, they appoint. You appoint someone and say, okay, now this is the person who is going to be in charge of dealing with the specific issues that you have. So I don't know, doesn't the accountability increase rather than decrease the administrative bureaucracy?
Yeah, I think it's more of scrutiny than accountability. It's a factor that when as individuals we demand to see, if you're going to tell us that this project will be done X, Y, Z, can we see who's running it, what are the papers, what are the cost implications? So it's more of a scrutiny question than on the accountability side of things. And even on the accountability side of things, with increased scrutiny, the questions becomes, if you can't do it and you need to appoint somebody else, so what are you doing here? So it's the scrutiny more than the accountability does the job. So it's it sort of becomes one of those aspects that in the wider scheme of things, it's going to put the wider bureaucratic system under very, very it's pretty much under the lens. So yeah, it's one of those as you had asked, basically what are some of the ways we can begin to move forward. Some of these forces are not are not pretty much in our hands. They're simply opportunities we have to be able to shift some of these things. So for example, the other one is the narrative war, which is...
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, and in many ways we've won. They're playing catch up, and I don't think they have, if the state has to go after, has to go head to head with a random podcaster somewhere, or somebody vlogging somewhere, or somebody running a blog somewhere, or somebody who's basically has the skills to be able to take what they do and sit down and take Kenyans through what they've done, or a documentary filmmaker somewhere who's questioning some of the things they're doing. So the narrative war is working in favor of citizens in many aspects. Of course, the state has its, the wider institutions have their, resources, and they'll try to get some of these Cambridge Analyticas into this space. But in the wider scheme of things, I think Kenyans are winning the narrative war. I think they're debunking a lot of the things they've been told for so long, and nobody would have, there are no spaces or, outlets for alternative conversations, which there are so many right now. I mean, it looks up to that end. So the narrative war is the other one. Opening up the country to the north is the other one, where basically...
beyond the railway, basically.
Yeah, getting everything outside of the colonial... get everything away. We can no longer have a country where if you are 100 kilometers and beyond outside of the railway line, you're basically not that significant. So moving north, of course, will come with, it's not just a question of economic expansion. There's a lot of cultural conversations to have. There's a lot of, social conversations to be had about the identity of, some of the communities and ethnicities in the north, which for the longest time have not been considered. What is this ethnicity at the coast? Or is it the Makonde down at the coast?
The Shona.
And the Shonas, and the
Nubians.
Yeah, people who say, why is the government calling us others? So if you begin to decentralize, then you begin to get into people's faces, and when you get into people's faces, then you have to begin to acknowledge who they are. We can't play the colonial game of, writing people out of, their spaces and their lands. So,
or telling them to assimilate and look more like Wazungus or even Kikuyus.
Yeah, so when moving the country north is not just infrastructure development and all these kind of economic, there are a lot of social questions that will come up, there are a lot of cultural questions that will come up along the way, all for the good, because it'll force the country to begin to question some of the narrative it's pushed on, certain ethnicities, certain groups, certain regions, certain peoples along the way. And what comes out eventually from that is a country that generally rethinks how it's always regarded itself and some of the people who live under it. So I see that also as another move, towards the north. So the narrative war, the expansion, mostly northwards, because that's where you still have a lot of spaces. There's also a space for, or rather a place for, consolidation of our historical narrative. We do it, sort of sporty. You have some libraries out there trying to handle it. We have all these online spaces. We handle it in some of our blogs and podcasts, individuals doing it on their pages, on social media. But then there's just a space or a place for rewriting, basically, or rather writing properly what has been our history over the last
and
130 years, or even the 200 years.
And doing more commemorations through holidays, what do you call, landmarks. Encouraging more publications and performances and festivals.
Definitely. I mean, they're just, now that, even dealing in now the cultural question, what has been, what are holidays? Why do we have some Thompson Gazelles and Lake Michelson up there?
Oh yeah.
Those, I mean, we have
and
many
Lake
people.
Victoria.
Yeah, Namlolwe back at my neighborhood, the other side. So, getting to that, getting to basically have some of the people who've never been considered, you learn there's so many interesting aspects in our history that haven't gotten the kind of, I mean, they could be whole biopic movies by themselves, and films, but we haven't come around to having that proper history so properly written and distilled into the society through poems, through songs, through blog
novels,
posts, through novels, all these, such that they become part of our everyday conversation, the same way you talk about Dostoevsky and Shakespeare. So we also have our own people who've done some incredible stuff around here that, getting to properly write this history. And also it's a healing moment, because institutionalized amnesia, as Joyce Nyairo, the cultural critic, talks about. I mean, that's how we begin to cure that. That's how we begin to have a newer sense of what time looks like, where we were from, who are we, how are we here, and how do we relate to our environment, our families, the people around us, how do we deal with the ethnic question, the language question, some of our own nuances and stereotypes, So that aspect of history is also another opportunity. It's also another space where the cultural conversation, the institutions that we've had, we're doing a bit of that. There's still much of it going on, but there's a need for a greater collaboration among these spaces. So those are some of those pointers I see in the society as a way from here going forward.
Okay, so we've really talked a lot. There's so many other things I wanted to talk about, but the conversation has gone quite a bit. Like one of the things I would like to talk about maybe in another conversation is technology and the kinds of myths around technology, because David Graeber said some really interesting things about tech that have released me to stop worshiping it as heaven. But I think we've really gone over time. I just want to thank you very much for such an engaging conversation. So refreshing, because it's not what is being discussed right now in the mainstream media and the people who follow it. So this was really refreshing. Once again, I just want to honor David Graeber. I'm so sad that he left before we had time to really think about what he was saying. But I hope that these are the kinds of conversations we can keep going. And I have to think about how we can make this a regular conversation on the Maisha Kazini channel. So yeah.
I think it's he did some good work. He laid some good groundwork for conversations around, you know, the psychology of movements, how some of these movements came up, how they're able to have conversations. I mean, we have to keep in mind he is one of the main people who drove Occupy Wall Street, which is one of the most significant movements Americans had. And, you know, it brought certain conversations into the public space that I don't think as a society that had, you know, at such a scale, you know, and even locally.
And he paid the cost. He paid the cost for it because he also didn't get his contract renewed at Yale. And after that, no university wanted to touch him. So he ended up going to work in the UK because of that. And I read on the website that in fact he couldn't mention some of the names of people who were involved in Occupy Wall Street because they were being followed by you know those are things you never imagined you'd hear about the United States, but it's happening. So
it does. So it's good that it's a conversation. I mean, I think there's always much more to get out of you know, what he said, how much groundwork he laid for us, how much you know, and considering locally we are now simply at the beginning point of, you know, a movement, a class conversation that has been had here and there, beginning to properly you know, consolidate and get into the public space. And so we are basically now more than ever, David Graeber's writings and musings, you know, his ideas really will come in handy in us trying to understand, okay, so where do we go from here? We gave this class conversation an intellectual outlook, we gave it a social outlook, it's gaining a political outlook, which we, you know, we'll be quizzical about, but it's here with us, and also resting on the hope that it'll outlive that political side of it, but still it will be the conversation that we'll have for a decade or so. So Graeber, you know, may his soul rest in peace, gave us so much more that we can work with. So I would be glad for us to pick up at, you know, this conversation somewhere down the road on just what did that mean for him in terms of his understanding of movements, and what we can glean from him, even as we begin to think about the class conversation here and the movement consolidating around it.
Okay. So Darius Okolla, thank you very much.